Rich Sander here, and this is Moral Misfits. Today we have Dr. Anne Klaeysen here with us to talk about a good life. Hello, Anne. How you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you very much for coming on today. And in our past couple of weeks, we've been talking about different ethical points of view, but I thought it would be really nice to kind of talk about, well, what is a good humanist life? You know, what does that really mean? And I wanted to talk to you about those things because of what ethical culture does, secular humanist society does. Especially in New York, we have gatherings, we get together, we socialize. That's maybe not the same for a lot of places throughout the United States, that they don't have atheist groups or secular groups or skeptics groups or whatever those groups are. They may not have those particular opportunities. And Moral Misfits, I hope, is going to be one of those things that people will be able to come and watch and see and gather before they watch the show, and then hang out afterwards and either talk about the show or mingle amongst themselves. And ethical culture has been one of those places where they're already kind of doing that and have been doing it for a long time. And I think it's part about having friends and socializing, and we'll get more into that in the end. But I think that that's a big part about being a humanist.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, thank you. I really appreciate you asking me to be part of Moral Misfits. And I share your hope that people will be watching these videos together and having a conversation about them and socializing. And especially now that socializing has to be at a distance, I think we're finding different ways that we can be together. So I appreciate that. Humanists fall into roughly two categories. I mean, there are a lot of adjectives that go along with humanists.
Yes.
But for our purposes of this discussion, I think we can talk about secular humanists and religious humanists. And primarily the difference is the way in which we're organized. So secular humanists, I know you've had some folks on from the American Humanist Association, and I'm a member of that organization as well. And I've taught for the Center for Education, which is part of the AHA. And my daughter works for the AHA. So there's a lot of communication there. In fact, she's the communications manager. That's the secular part of humanism. And they're organized in terms of chapters. Religious humanists are partly ethical culture. We have ethical culture societies, ethical humanist societies. They all fall under the American Ethical Union. And there are also some Unitarian Universalists who identify as humanists as well. And the difference between a religious humanist and a secular humanist, basically, and we can find many differences individually, but I'd say in general, are the way they're organized. AHA is in chapters, and the American Ethical Union have societies which are congregations. And so our form of community, I'd say, is a little deeper and wider than a chapter would be.
Yeah.
We handle everything. I think you're going to get into it a little bit. I like to say we're there from womb till tomb. Whether it's the baby naming, coming of age, weddings, memorials, we're there throughout a person's life. And we also, as you mentioned, encourage community and socializing.
Well, I think those are all really important things that a humanist can point to and saying, we are a community that does have more than just being atheistic. It's certainly a lot more than that. And I don't think a lot of people realize that. They don't understand that there's, or have an opportunity to gather and to socialize and to celebrate certain things together. And I'm hoping that, like with Moral Misfits, we can reach a wider audience for that. But also, there is a richness of things that people can have as resources. And, you know, I think to people who want to educate their kids in a secular way or humanist way, that there's like weddings. You've officiated many weddings, right?
I have, yes.
Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned children because I was married at the Brooklyn Society for Ethical Culture, which is just a couple of blocks from where I live here in Brooklyn. And our children were welcomed into that community with baby namings. And they had a coming of age there and became part of the community. So we had what we called a Children's Sunday Assembly, which is basically ethics for children. Nice. So yeah, it's a kind of a community where and I'm glad you mentioned, atheistic, because we define ourselves as a non-theistic religion of ethics. And that's very similar to Buddhism. As you know, I'm a chaplain at NYU and at Columbia, and I'm in a number of interfaith settings. And we find that the humanists and the Buddhists tend to gravitate towards one another because we are both non-theistic religions of ethics. And so I think and wherever I'm allowed to be at the table, certainly not one that would be more traditionally theistic, but those settings whether it's a social justice setting or a chaplaincy setting, there's an understanding that we are non-theist, which means that there may or may not be a God. It's kind of irrelevant to us. It's not irrelevant to many people, but for us, it's not what informs our ethical behavior.
Well, and I think that if we can take maybe a step back and talk about the philosophy, about how that philosophy of being ethical, what that really means. And I had a conversation with Massimo Pigluicci back in the spring about, he was talking about Stoicism and being a Stoic. He wrote a couple of books. If you have a chance, you at home have a chance to go on the Moral Misfits channel, you can scroll down and see my interview with Massimo. And what he's really talking about, and I think it's very similar to what's going on with ethical culture, is that there is a foundation of ethics, and there's certain principles that are about the virtues of life that make that life a better life. And that those principles are somewhat universal throughout the world. And we're going to take a second here and listen to Massimo talk about those things.
So we don't really have in our society, we don't practice moral education. Yeah. I mean, when we think about education, we tend to think about books and stuff that is useful to get a job, which is fine. That you need that.
But the let's say American culture is that while that morality is up to each individual person, you're not going to tell somebody what that morality or that ethic is. That's up for them to decide.
And the Stoics would say that's a fatal mistake. There is more than one way to be moral, that's for sure. That there's more than one correct path or good path to go through life from an ethical perspective. But no, this notion that everybody makes up his own, it's nonsense. I mean, that's essentially relativism. And it goes against human nature. I mean, one of the problem is, by nature, we tend to be social animals. So for instance, any kind of ethics that is antisocial, it's not good. It's not good for you, and it's not good for the rest of society.
So if somebody's looking at it and saying, okay, I want to improve and I want to get better and stuff, there is kind of a universal moral, ethical code, very basic,
yeah,
that can be taught, that can be shown as this is the better way of doing it.
There are at least some universal principles. So there is some research about this. Psychologists have done cross-cultural research on the concept of virtue, which we talked about earlier. And it turns out that every literate culture in the world has a concept of virtue. It also turns out that they pretty much all recognize the same subset of virtues. There is variation, of course, between cultures, as there is always the case in humanity, right? You pick something, there's going to be variation. But there is a core of about 6 attitudes or virtues that are pretty much present in every society. And these 6, interestingly, are the 4 Stoic ones, or variations thereabout. People use different terms, but those are the same 4 concepts. The Stoic, which I said also are the Christian ones, you find very similar virtues in Buddhism and so on and so forth. But those four, plus other two, these other two are often referred to as transcendence and humanity. Humanity is an attitude that reminds you that you are in fact a member of a larger sort of society, and that your thriving in life depends on the fact that you're interconnected with other people, and therefore.
So you wake up in the morning, you see the sunrise, you realize you're part of this greater world, you're somewhat insignificant, but then you turn around and you're facing everybody else and realizing, oh, they're also part of this world too.
Correct. So the Stoics didn't call this a virtue, but as I said earlier, they did have a concept of cosmopolitanism, which turns out to be essentially doing the same, carrying the same function. The sixth one is referred to as transcendence. So transcendence is this notion that there is something in the world that's greater than yourself. Now, and that it's meaningful. Now, a lot of people cash that out as the notion of God, obviously, right? So lots of religions across the world, lots of people think that in terms of transcendence, what's transcendent is the existence of some kind of divinity. But that's not the only way to cash out transcendence, right? So as I mentioned earlier, the Stoics were in awe of the laws of nature and how rational they are and how perfectly they work and how consistently they work. So they used that as transcendence. When Marcus Aurelius was looking at the sunrise, that was an exercise in transcendence. It was reminding himself that it was part of a sort of a broader whole. It doesn't have to be cashed down in terms of God. It often is, but it doesn't have to be. So those six seem to be pretty much universal. Now, why would they be universal? I think that's because they address something fundamental about human nature. In the human beings are essentially social. We're obviously pro-social animals. We don't do well in isolation. We thrive only in a social group, and we are capable of reason. That doesn't mean we're reasonable all the time or even most of the time, but we're capable of reason. We're actually reflecting on what we're doing and decided that we might want to do otherwise, right? For the Stoics and for a lot of other traditions, those two things are fundamental, reason and pro-sociality. And the Stoics actually turned it into a motto. The motto of their school is live according to nature. And live according to nature doesn't mean run naked into the woods and hug trees, although there's nothing wrong with that. It means use the two fundamental components of your human nature. Use your reason in order to improve society. That's what makes for a meaningful human life. If you use your ability to think through stuff, through problems, through issues, in order to improve everybody's life. The Stoics didn't make much of a distinction between your self interest and your societal interest. They thought that if you improve yourself, you're automatically improving society. And if you're working to make the world a better place, you're automatically making things better for you.
So Massimo really was talking about these ideas that are really, I think, exemplified in ethical culture, being pro-social, using science and reason to understand our natural world, the world we live in, and what we need to do. And one of the things I remember you talking about in the past is about Felix Adler, the founder of ethical culture. And he talked about one particular thing that everybody talks about being good in life and about treating other people in a certain way. And like the golden rule is to treat others as you want to be treated. But you were talking about how Felix Adler was saying, well, why don't we go one further? Why don't we treat people or have an interaction with other people that elicits the better response or the best possible response? You've talked about that many times.
Thank you. And I'm so glad that you showed the video from Massimo. He and I have done a lot together. And of course, I hope you promote the book, How to Live a Good Life, because Massimo is one of the editors, and I contributed a chapter on ethical culture. Of course, he wrote about Stoicism. Yes, so what Felix Adler, who founded ethical culture in 1876, said that a supreme ethical rule should be act in ways to bring out the goodness in others and thereby in ourselves. And he used different vocabulary. Sometimes he said act so as to bring out the best, or the latent goodness, or the unique excellence. The different words that he used really amount to forging an ethical relationship. And as you say, I I don't like the golden rule because it assumes that I know what's best for you. I don't.
Or that we know
I
what's
always
best
know.
for ourselves.
Right. And sometimes we don't know what's best for ourselves either.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think, but what I appreciate about Adler's reformulation of it is to say it's about the relationship. And that when we engage in a dynamic ethical relationship, I'm always listening. What are your needs? What are your concerns? What are your values? What makes you good? What are the ways that you behave that I recognize as goodness, and what does that elicit in me? And I just think that is a much better foundation for ethical behavior, because I'm not staying with myself. I'm starting with myself, but I'm open. It's the invitation. It's opening up as a welcome to have that relationship. So act in ways that elicit the goodness in others and thereby in ourselves.
Well, I think that that's such an important aspect of philosophy of ethical culture and humanism, because we're really trying to reach out to the rest of the world and say, hey, there's a better way of doing this. And they may not know of what ethical culture does, or may not even know what a humanist is. And we're hoping that this is a way for them to realize it's like, oh, if I'm not churched, or I'm not religious, or I'm not a theist or a non-theist or atheist or secular, if I'm one of those things and I'm thinking about my life and I turn around and I say, well, how can I live a good life? What are those ethics? And Massimo's talked about those 6 virtues that are universal. I think that that's important, and ethical culture has a lot. People can go to the ethical culture website and look up all the things that you guys are doing, which is amazing. And I think that a person who's coming to this can realize that there's a lot of things, and you talked about them before, about, raising your child, or, I've been single my whole life. They may be single or not married yet, or not have a partner, that, well, how do I live that ethical life? And how do I do that? And, there's certainly knowledge and the philosophy, but there's also the fun part about it. It's gathering and having social events and doing baby naming and coming of age or weddings. So I think the whole life, there are those things that you guys are, what ethical culture's done. I shouldn't say you guys, because you're the former leader of ethical culture, but you're a participant obviously still. But it's something that people can realize that there's much more to being a humanist and being outside of theology of a greater, or I shouldn't say greater, or somebody outside of themselves. They got it within themselves to be a good person, and to work on it all life long. We're always working hard at it. And you've talked about that many times at Ethical Culture, about, it's a work in progress.
And you're right that many people are doing this on their own naturally. And so when they discover that there's something like ethical culture or humanists or moral misfits, I hope they discover your videos as well. When they discover it, there's a kind of a feeling of, wow, there are other people like that. Recently, I taught a class for Union Theological Seminary, and I taught on humanist life passage ceremonies. And the people who participated in the class came from different backgrounds. Some of them were students at UTS. They were MDiv students, or some of them were getting a master's. Others were lifelong learners and came in. And every one of them, to a person, said, I've been doing some of this already. I never knew that there were organizations that promote this, that there are resources that I can use, that much of what I'm doing is very consistent with humanism. So each one of them, I had, and they contacted me separately after the class, and of course, do class evaluations. And the prevailing feeling was, thank goodness that there are people out there who feel the same way we do, who share our values, and who are forming communities. And so it's just such a joy for me to offer a class like that, and to know, as I always suspect, that there are many people out there who share our values.
Yeah.
It's not unusual for me to do a ceremony, whether it's a wedding or a memorial, and have some of the guests come up to me afterwards and say, that was the most spiritual ceremony I have ever attended, and you never mentioned God. And so it speaks to a kind of this worldly spirituality that has to do with connection. It has to do with connecting people together and finding the sacred, if you will, in that relationship, and not in an otherworldly aspect or anyway, this worldly perspective.
And I think you're right. And I know I use maybe slightly a different vernacular. I would talk about my emotions, my emotional connection to other people. Sometimes when I feel like I'm getting a good conversation with somebody, I'll get goosebumps. That they're listening to me, I'm listening to them, we're exchanging things, whether it's learning or if it's just, having a beer on Friday nights with Drinking with Atheists that we do in New York. Those are really fun events, and there's all these things that make your life so much more fulfilling. And we've talked about these different things during our life, but I think that people don't realize that, okay, there's also a process toward the end of life. And I sat down with John Wagner again in the spring, and we talked about this idea about, how do we have control over that particular process of the life ending. And if people want to watch that interview, I talked with John Wagner for over an hour about many different subjects, but he was talking here about people's involvement in those rights and choices that people can have control over their life. Well, I have control over my life every day, what I do, and toward the end of that, we should have the right to make those decisions. So this is what John had to say.
Another area that we're really interested in right now that is an ongoing battle is the ability of a person to make decisions about the end of life. So currently the Secular Coalition has an ongoing coalition effort with Compassion and Choice and other groups. And one of the things that they're trying to do is give a person who is diagnosed at the end of their life the right to end it humanely. Essentially, there are a series of provisions that are in place to make sure the individual's rights are protected. But if a person is clearly near the end of their life, they would like to end their life, and they're judged by physicians to be of sound mind, there's a desire of a lot of people to be able to essentially have a physician's help in ending their life peacefully.
Is that
that doesn't exist in New York right now,
Yeah.
but we're working to get it passed. It's been passed in a number of different states, in Oregon and California and DC, I think 8 right now. And we'd like to extend that thing to New York. One of the more interesting experiences I had in trying to pass this law was actually up at the New York State Fair in Syracuse, which is a great place to go. You can meet all kinds of people and have a great time. But we, along with Compassion and Choice, we set up a table in one of the industrial buildings. Where there are lots of people pitching different ideas, some political, some educational. But we talked to people and tried to get signatures promoting the idea of compassion and choice, that people should have the right to control the end of their lives. And one of the things that I found really fascinating was that after being there for 3 or 4 hours, I could start sort of classifying people's responses. Some people would listen, they'd be open, they'd want to understand. Some people had an experience with somebody who had a very difficult death, who appreciated the difficulties, who wanted to talk about it, and how a law could be managed and changed in New York, and they were often very supportive. I talked to a lot of healthcare professionals who, again, had immediate experience, who were interested and generally supportive. But then one of the groups that I often ran into were people who were religious who said, oh no, I can't even talk about that. I'm not allowed to even think about that. That's wrong. God doesn't want people to take their own life. So it's this sort of inability to discuss things and to interact and talk about how laws should be put in place to satisfy human values. That is one of the really important aspects of humanism that is often lacking in people who are overly religious.
So just having that opportunity to discuss it and be open for a discussion and have that back and forth, that's a key aspect of being human anywhere.
Yeah, but it's something that's not allowed to some people, or at least they don't see it as something that's permissible from their religion. They don't even want to discuss it.
Yeah.
And it was really fairly remarkable.
So you could have a corn dog and talk about the end of life. And depending on the corn dog, it might end your life. So John there was really given a good case that we have these opportunities to get a legal right to make decisions about our end of life and how we get to choose that. And I think that that's part of that whole life process. You talked about womb to tomb. And here we talk about a process of going from realizing that maybe, okay, I'm toward the end of my life and I want to have control over it with so many diseases and illnesses and injuries that we experience as we pass away. To have some modicum of control over it might be worthy to a lot of people. I'll tell a little bit of a story that my dad passed away a couple years ago, and he died very quickly. But he had heart disease, and he had heart problems, and had 3 bypasses during his life, but he was still able to live to 87. So, and he was exercising when he had the final heart attack and died, and it was quick. Not a lot of people have that opportunity to go through that end of life phase in a way that is, ethical and it is of some kind of respect for themselves. And you guys talk about an ethical culture all the time about that.
We do, absolutely. First of all, I use a certain language, and I say that people die. Not that they passed or passed away, but people die. And so I think that's important language to use, because once we use language like, they passed or passed away, there's an implication of some other life. And while some people believe in that, I don't. And so I use that language. A few years ago, I participated in a symposium. Actually, Massimo did as well. He and I bump into each other a lot. And it was called Death Without Deity. And we both gave presentations on that. So it was a very important symposium. And it's important because so many people choose to die without a deity, and they are not allowed to do so. And I think that's a very important role for chaplains to play. I mentioned that I'm a university chaplain. There are also chaplains whom we've certified in the American Ethical Union who are hospice and healthcare chaplains. And one of the things that came up at that symposium were people who were in hospital settings or hospice settings where the chaplains, and they are not supposed to do this. The profession of chaplain is to be there to meet people where they are. Nonetheless, people found that often when they were in healthcare facilities or when their relatives or friends were in hospice, that the chaplains and other staff acted as though there was a theistic belief, a traditional faith belief, and would refer to them that way. And it's very disconcerting and very disrespectful to do that. And so a lot of what we do is try to educate people about that, especially chaplains. So when I'm in different circles, and again, when I'm allowed to sit at the table as a religious humanist, I always make that very clear. One of our members, well, several of our members sadly have died, but one in particular, Moira, was in hospice. And of course, I came to visit her. And one day she said, "Thank goodness you're here. Will you please tell these people to leave me alone?" The nurses were saying, "Oh, please don't be afraid. You're going to heaven. You're going to a better place." And when she said, "I'm not afraid. I'm not going to heaven, and please stop saying this," they would treat her as though she had dementia. They were so disrespectful. So, bear in mind that when we say death with dignity, it's not only the choices we make in terms of whether or not we want our life sustained by some means, but also that our values are respected. And I think that's so important. There's one organization I think that does that very well, and that's the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. And I often refer people to their website and to the literature that they have, the resources they have on spirituality, because unlike theistic organizations and theistic chaplaincies, they're very aware that when we talk about spirituality in terms of healthcare, we're talking about one's inner resources. And I think they do that extremely well.
Great. And I think those are opportunities for people to have more knowledge about life and about what's going on. And if you're going to have a good life, let's try to have a good death. Let's try to make that a good experience for the person who has to die. And I think that the thing that gets me so excited about humanism is that there is this richness and fullness of womb to tomb, that it's all during the life, and that at the end of it, we can gather as community to celebrate that particular person's life and to remember the goodness that they brought into the world, that they had an ethical life, that they did things. My father struggled a lot. He was Catholic, very devout, and he confided it to me many times that he struggled with this idea of was his life worth it? Did he make his life worth it? And I absolutely right away said, your life was amazing. The things you did, you raised 9 children and you had provided for them. You were able to retire at a decent age. You had 30, 40 years of retirement. Those are amazing things. And he gave of himself and he gave to charity. He worked for charities. He did those things. And I just found that very odd that he couldn't celebrate his life while he was still alive and thinking that it was worthy. And I think that we as humanists can do that. We can tell people, hey, let's celebrate our life. While we're here, while we're alive, while we're doing things, while all that's happening and stuff, we celebrate that life. We celebrate it each and every time that we meet and gather. That it's those interactions are precious because we don't know, it could end very quickly. But it's also a point for us to be able to get together and celebrate our life almost every time we gather.
How very loving of you to say that to your father. I think you're addressing something I think is so important, that we forget sometimes to appreciate others and to tell them the ways in which they enrich our lives, and to do it on a regular basis. Felix Adler, again, the founder of ethical culture, said that one of the sadnesses is that people don't think well of one another. And even sadder is that people don't think well of themselves.
Yeah.
And so the sadness is your father not thinking well of himself, but how fortunate that he had a son who could reflect back to him how much he was appreciated and how good he was and what a wonderful life he had. And again, it's just one of the many reasons that we need community. We need one another to be reflecting that back to us. I just want to say one thing that I think we do particularly well that can be challenging for more theistic traditions in terms of memorials is suicides.
Yeah.
I have now officiated for 4 suicides. 3 of them were middle-aged white men with grown children. And one of them, tragically, just this spring, was a 17-year-old boy, a member of the Brooklyn Society. And what we do is we name it. We name that tragedy, that decision that someone has made to end a life, and it coming from a deep place of pain. And that no matter how much we love someone, we cannot make that decision for them. Of course, a 17-year-old is a very different situation than the three men I talked about. And that was a particular challenge for us because he grew up in the Brooklyn Society, and we had a green burial before all of this pandemic, so we could actually, thank goodness, meet in person. And we've had to postpone his memorial until we can get together. But I think, again, naming what's so difficult to be named, and confronting it and saying, you know, we're strong enough to do this, and we're loving and caring enough to see each other through it.
And I think what is so important in life is that we act in a way, like you were talking about Felix Adler, we act in a way that elicits the best out of others, and that we can see sometimes when people are hurting, and that we can empathize and be compassionate, and we can be kind. And these are all things that in a life, these should be how we act each and every day. And I've been surprised in my life over and over again about, and I've traveled quite a bit, how nice people are everywhere, and that they're trying. And it dismays me sometimes when I see that there are people out there that are trying to ruin this great life that we have in terms of, or a great opportunity, I should say, to have a great life and to enrich that life of other people. That some people are ruining it, and it probably comes from being hurt inside and not feeling that they're worthy, and they want to bring other people down, or some people feeling like they're superior and they want to have one up on everybody and stuff. You know, the current political climate in the United States right now has a lot of animus to it, and you know, I've succumbed to some of that. I've struggled to talk to some people on the other side, and you know, I'm certainly nice and whatever. I just say, okay, I just don't want to talk to those particular people anymore, because it affects my mood. I want my mood to be lighthearted and kind. And you know, I empathize what's going on, but at some particular point, I have to pull myself away in order for my own happiness. But if we're talking about an overall life that is worth that we put our worth into that life, and we look back and say, like Massimo, we look back and say, is that a life worth living? Did I like that life? Was it virtuous? Did some good come of it and stuff? And I think that's important, and getting together at the end of it for people to sit around and talk about that particular person there's a cathartic aspect to it, because we're all trying to deal with that emotion of losing somebody, or I shouldn't say losing, but that person dying. I'll remember about
you can choose to say it any way you wish, Rich.
Well, you know, I like what your thought process about saying passing away, because that's you know, them dying and being dead is really what it is. And it is final, and it is the end of it, and it makes life a lot more precious. To another conversation that I had with both of my folks is they both were suffering health problems. So in the late 90s, I said, well, I'm living in a different city or different state. I'm probably not going to be there when they die. And I certainly wasn't with my dad. But at the time, I had the conversation with them that saying, I'm not going to be here probably most likely when you die, you know, and I want us to say whatever we want to say to each other, that we say that now. And we did. We said we loved each other, and that we appreciated each other. You know, that was long before the political climate caused problems. But in the end, I had another 20 years with my dad, you know, and for up until the last couple of years, every time or most of the time when he calls, it's like, well, hello, how you doing? Oh, you're still alive, you know? It's like, let's celebrate that, you know? It was like, I felt like it was bonus points for me. It felt like I turned what was going to be a tragedy into 20 years of celebrating his and my mom's life by saying, you know, how grateful I was to that they were alive, and that we were able to share even more moments together. So that's what it felt like to me and stuff. And I look back at my life and it's like, can I do that with other people? Can I do that more in my life with other people? You know, I'm struggling with some people who are in the hospital and suffering terribly. And it hurts me to see them in such pain and going through such anguish. But as Massimo said, there are certain things you can do and certain things you can't do, you know, and I tell them I'm thinking about them. I try to communicate with them as much as I can, but it's up to the science and the doctors and the treatment. They may get better, they may not. And, you know, I have to come to realization that they might die. But if they come out of it and come back to life, you know, it's all bonus points.
I'd like to pick up on a couple of things that you said, Rich. First of all, on the empathy and how important empathy is. And the most important part of empathy is presence. And it seems like a small thing sometimes to be present, but it's a very, very big thing. And the core of empathy is presence. And that's where we're making a commitment to sit with somebody. And whether it's in person, on the phone, on Zoom, whatever it is, that we're committing ourselves for during that time and in that space to be present. The second thing is to not be making judgments, that we're listening without judgment. And we're also listening without formulating a response, but rather listening without that need to respond or to reply. And then when there's a moment to ask, I really listened to you and I'm wondering, would you like to hear what I'm thinking about what you said now? Because too often people will come in and they'll say, oh, I know exactly what you're saying. Oh, something like that happened to me, or let me give you some advice. None of those things are empathy. And I think, you know, especially, you know, we talk about New Yorkers and there's the New York Minute and we jump into things. It really takes, you know, some deep breathing and to breathe while we're listening to someone so that we're not jumping in, so that we're asking those questions. I'm thinking something right now about what you said, and I'm wondering if it would be helpful for you to hear it. And if not, that's okay. So, you know, empathy, how important that is with our presence. Another thing is that time you said, my dad lived to 101. Aren't we both lucky that we have that? So Dad used to say 70 in the Bible, and everything after that is bonus. But there's something also called, I think we know, all of us know about legal wills. I'd like to put in a pitch for ethical wills. And if you Google that now, you'll see there's a cottage industry now on ethical wills. A legal will is how you assign your valuables. An ethical will is how you document and share what your values are. And it can take so many different forms. Years ago, when I was traveling out of the country, my children were still young, I wrote them each a letter about if I shouldn't come back. You know, what if something happened? And I realized later that that was in a form of an ethical will. And what we're saying is, here's what I love about you and what I appreciate about you. Here are my values. And having that conversation with somebody. Another thing I want to say is we haven't been able to do it in person, but at the New York Society for many years, we had something called the Death Cafe. And it's a place where people can get together and talk about what you were saying, Rich, talk about what gives my life meaning, and how can I find joy in my life. And one of the more practical things that people who gathered for the Death Cafe would do would be to put together a living will, an ethical will, a legal will, a power of attorney, to put together all of those things. And once you've done that, they're up on the shelf, you've communicated to people, you don't have to worry about it. Now together, the Death Cafe found that it was such a wonderful experience for them, primarily because, unlike you, their children didn't want to talk about their eventual deaths. Yeah. No, Mom, you're never going to die. No, Dad, I don't want to hear about it. And so they were able to talk about with other people about the inevitability of their deaths, and to find the joy in it. and to find the meaning in it, and to recognizing that it really is never too late. It's never too late to forgive and to be forgiven. It's never too late to tell somebody that you love them, and to give that gift of presence, the gift of empathy.
Well, I think that we definitely talked about the womb to tomb here today. That was really about having that good life. It's a good life. We can hopefully let other people out there who are maybe feeling like they're alone, that they have these thoughts about, well, I don't believe in a God. I don't believe in theism. I don't go to church, but I don't have community, and or I don't realize that there are other people out there that are like me. There are lots, and hopefully we can find a way to gather those people. And I hope that Moral Misfits, after COVID's over with, that we start to find a way for people to gather if they're in, in a small community or in a suburb or in an urban city, that they find ways that they can gather, let's say on a Sunday night, and they can gather for maybe an hour, and they can do a potluck, or they can meet at a restaurant or a bar, and then they watch Moral Misfits. They watch the show that we're going to do, or watch this show, and then they stay and hang around later afterwards. I think that one of the biggest things as humanists we can do is try to find other humanists, other people who are non-theist, that are atheist, that are secular minded, that are pro-science, that are looking for a way to understand our natural world, or our real world, the actual world and universe, and find their place in it. And if they want to watch more about what we did with Massimo, again, it was like an hour long with Massimo. Check it out on Moral Misfits and look for Massimo Pigluicci, and then also for John Wagner. How could people, if they're finding the things that you were saying today interesting, how do they get a hold of you?
I'll give you my email address.
We'll put it in the description,
okay.
An email address that you want people to
Sure.
talk to you about. We'll also put some links in there about some of the things you talked about today, so they can click and go right to those. But I want to thank you for your time today. It was great to catch up with you again. I know it's been a while. I think it was earlier this year we caught up a little bit, but that was great to be able to do that. And if people want to get a hold of us, I'll have my email down there. And I want to thank you for your time today. Really appreciate it.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much. I'd just like to say about one of my favorite ethical culture leaders is John Lovejoy Elliott, who founded Hudson Guild as part of the Settlement House movement. And he said, I've known good people who believed in God, and I've known good people who didn't believe in God. He said, but it's good people who believe in other people. Those are the ones who are my good neighbors.
That's great to end on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.